If you're just joining us, thank you for being here. I think we're ready to begin. I'm going to hand it over to Anna Spiersko for a few comments, and then she will introduce today's speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Designing Video Games, a Research Opportunity for the Informs Community with Dr. Chris Ryan. Today, Tracy, can you go to the next slide? So as you will notice in this webinar, you all are muted. However, you will be able to use the Q&A to post questions throughout the course of the seminar. You can post questions at any point during the hour. If you see a question that you would like to have an answer to, click the thumbs up to upvote that question, and that will put the question up higher. And then if you're having any kind of technical issues, please post that in the chat. And there will be a recording of this presentation that will be shared later afterwards. And so this webinar today is sponsored by the Inform Speakers Program. The goal of the Inform Speakers Program is to connect Informs members, especially student chapters, with volunteer speakers who would bring their expertise to where you are. So if you are interested in planning an event, you can go to the Inform Speakers Program website, search for the available speakers, request a speaker, or if you are interested in becoming a speaker, you can go ahead and apply to become a speaker and update your speaker information. The Informs Speakers Program did go fully virtual due to COVID-19 in the fall of 2020. However, we are beginning to accept some in-person requests if both the chapter and the speaker are comfortable attending an in-person event. However, moving forward into the future, we will still be able to hold virtual events to help connect you with more speakers and help hold more events than previously. So please check it out and spread the word. So now that you know about the Inform Speakers Program, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Chris Ryan. He is an associate professor in the Operations and Logistics Division at the University of British Columbia in the Tozer School of Business. His research interests include optimization, theoretical economics, operations management, organizational learning, pedagogy, and business history. We're now going to turn it over to Chris. Thank you so much, Dr. Ryan, for presenting to our students today.
As of course, it's my pleasure. I just want to share my screen. Let's hope this works. Yes, share. Can everybody see my screen? Is that displaying, Anna? You can see it? Okay,
Yes,
perfect.
we can see it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so thank you everybody for the invitation. It's a great opportunity to be here with all of you. I can't see people's faces, so I'm going to be talking into the ether, but I'm used to that by now, teaching online sometimes. So I think I have quite a few of the people also listed on this slide in attendance. I just can't see them, and you probably can't see them either. I just want to say to start out, this is joint work with some good friends of mine, Li Fei Sheng, who is at the University of Houston Clear Lake. I've been doing video game research with her for quite a few years now, I think 6-7 years. We work on many things together. Yifu Li, he's in China at Shanghai Jiao Tong Liverpool University, and we've been working on some projects recently. Xuying Zhao is at Notre Dame. I started working with her a couple of years ago, and recently Wilma and Osama Hangor, who are at Columbia University. And last but not least is Benny Wong. He is an undergrad student here at UBC, who I did some video game research with over the summer. So I want to talk a little bit about his work as well. Okay, so the theme of today's presentation is about video games. And I do really believe that video games are an opportunity for the Informs community to study in more depth. I should say that there's quite a few people who have been working on this for a while over the years as well. So I saw Xiaolei is in the audience from Columbia and a bunch of other people as well. I will try to do a little bit of a literature review, say some names of people working, but it's not going to be an exhaustive kind of literature coverage of what people have done in video games. And also I should mention that people in computer science and other communities other than the Informs community have also been working on the question of video game design for some years as well. But I do really believe that specifically operations researchers have a real opportunity to do something in this space. So that's why I'm excited about it. I want to introduce just the idea of video games. And in the description of this talk, I mentioned something I'm sure many people know is that video games is the largest sector, the largest part of the education sector in the economy. So video games are a big business, okay? And not just big monetarily, okay, but also big culturally. So I'm sure many of you can pick out some characters in this in this slide that are familiar to you from your childhood. So we have Mario, we have Bowser, and a bunch of other characters here. And I think what I like about video game research is it brings me back to when I was a child. I played video games as a child, and video games, for people who play video games, it's when you think about them, okay? And I think that's the part that I enjoy connecting my current research to the thoughts and the questions that I had as a child, which sort of brings me back a sense of fun and a sense of childishness, if you like, associated with his research that makes it fun, okay? So I would like to just give you my personal history with games as a way to sort of ground why I'm so enthusiastic about this research area. And everybody has their own history with video games for people who have played video games in their life. But I just want to give my own personal history to give you an idea of where I'm coming from with this. I started playing video games in 1984. I was about 4 years old, actually. This is before the era of iPads and all that. So what we had is Atari. Atari is this very interesting system, and the games are very simple, as you can see on the left there. They're basically one screen or two or three screen games that have very few moving parts. But of course, we were totally fanatical about those when we were kids. Our life totally changed when we got this Nintendo Entertainment System, 1986, and the game started to get a lot more elaborate and certainly lived very large in my imagination. And I'm going to talk about some of that as we go through these slides. I started thinking about questions of design probably when I was 6 or 7 years old. Like, why is the game like this? And why is it not like this? And this part is too hard. This part is too easy. So I had thoughts about, okay, how would I design my own game when I was a young child? And that's the part that's exciting for me, is I'm revisiting some of those ideas. And then over time, things got even more complicated, and kind of my personal history with my daily obsession with video games probably ends in 1996. So that's why I have this date here ending with the Super Nintendo, which is probably, in my mind, still looms very large for me, this video game system. But of course, things have gone much farther since then. There's longer history after that era than before that era. And nowadays, the video game industry is huge and broken up into many different segments. There's the online, massively multiplayer segment, like this League of Legends that I'm showing here. And then there's also games in people's pockets. So now we all carry around a phone, and the phone has games on them, and we play them in the supermarket when we're waiting in line, etc. And during this pandemic, the COVID pandemic, video game play has skyrocketed. Okay, so it's an industry definitely on the upswing, and many innovations and things are happening there. Okay, so that's my own personal history. So I just, out of total bias for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to call the era that I grew up thinking about these problems as the classical era, and then after that as the modern era. And I'm just going to use that to distinguish the different kinds of questions one can look at. So I'll just now describe a few research problems, I think, or research areas that one can look at in the design of video games. And the first one is what I call level design. Okay, so I'm not sure if you had the experience of playing a game and wondering, okay, why does this level look like this? Okay, so in this one is Mega Man 2. Mega Man 2, we start in the top corner there, and we go through this level, which has sort of horizontal and vertical segments until we fight the boss at the end. And I was always curious, okay, why do they place that enemy there versus somewhere else? Where should I locate it? How should it look? What should the layout be? This is always a puzzling thing for me as a child. And this question is still a very dominant question in today's marketplace. So the game on the right here is Jetpack Joyride. And that game is interesting because it's sort of a game that has almost like a single infinite level. So the genre is called an endless runner. And they procedurally generate, randomly generate the elements of the level. Okay, so you can have a static level design problem or like this randomly generated, or what they call in the industry, procedurally generated levels, with the goal of trying to like make the level fun and interesting, not too hard, not too easy. These are the kinds of questions that one can think about when designing levels. Another problem that I thought about as a child, what I call a classical era problem, is world design, which is basically how do we assemble levels together? How do we put collections of levels into some kind of map or some kind of arrangement in a world, which is the terminology typically in games. So the game on the left here is the Super Mario Brothers 3. This is a classic game known for its design. And this is World 1. And you see there's actually 7 levels. Those black boxes are the levels. And they're kind of arranged in interesting ways. So I remember distinctly thinking as a child when I played this game, if you look at it, the goal is actually to get to this castle. Okay, this castle here, the red and white castle. Somehow my pointer disappears. So I don't know how, I can't seem to point on the slide, but you can see that it's kind of, you don't really need to go to level 3 there. So the third level looks to be optional because you can go from level 2 to this castle to level 5 to level 6 and finally to the final castle. So I've always thought, okay, why did they arrange it that way? Why did they make certain levels optional? How should I arrange it? And it's basically like a graph design problem that I'll talk about a little later on. It's from the classical era, but I should say that how to design world and how to arrange things in proximity to each other and allow access to at certain times of the game, this remains an important question. In like sandbox games or these big world, open world games, this is really the important question. How do I design the world and the proximity of the encounters to each other, and how should they be arranged, and what kind of precedences should there be? So this remains a very important question in the industry. Another classical era design question is what's called balance, typically called balance in the industry, which is the idea. So what the game on the left here is Street Fighter 2 is a classic game. This game is still played in competitions to this day. What they're trying to do, what you would like to design to be, as you can see, there's 8 characters that the players can select from, and they play 1 versus 1. So you choose a character, somebody else, I choose a character, and we fight each other. Now, what balance means here is I don't want one of these characters to be overpowered, meaning that character can easily defeat some of the other characters. That would be what's considered a lack of balance and considered poor design in the video game industry. The reason is very simple, is that actually designing a character takes a lot of design effort, and you don't want that character to have nobody who plays it. Okay, so it's sort of a waste of effort to design a character that nobody uses. Typically what's done in the industry is they design these characters and they have play testing. So players sort of, they hire a bunch of people to play the game and sort of look at, okay, this character has this advantage or this disadvantage, and how do I balance all of that? I think there is hope that one could do more optimization or some other kinds of ways of thinking about how to balance games. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. This is, of course, still a very relevant issue and actually got even more complicated. So the game on the right here is League of Legends. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this game. And you can see this is just one page of the available characters. I think, I don't know the exact numbers, but but it's like maybe 80 or 90 characters that one can choose from. And it's more complicated because instead of being one-on-one, it's actually 5 versus 5. So you have teams of 5 against teams of 5. And this becomes, the balancing question is a really critical question that really goes to the bottom line of these companies, because they basically make money from selling skins and other kinds of things for new characters that come in. And then balancing the game to make it feel fair and make it feel fun is one of the largest challenges. So balance is a classical problem that remains very forefront in the video game design space. And the last one, I actually haven't heard too much people talk about this, and in a sense, it's another kind of balancing, but I wanted to give it a different name, which is diversity. What you would like in a game is for the player, as they evolve through the game, it makes sense for them to take different strategies. Okay, you don't always just take the same strategy over and over again. So the game on the right here, on the left here, is RC Pro-Am. This is a game I played. I noticed all my examples, I think, from like 1988 to 1991 when I was, a child. But I played this game a lot as a child. And always, there was a screen where you basically get to invest certain of your experience points or your money into the different elements of your car. So it has tires, acceleration, and top speed. And it never seemed to make a difference which one I chose. Okay, it doesn't matter which I invested in, I seem to do the same on the track. So this would be a kind of a poor design where the player is given a choice, but that choice doesn't seem to matter. So you might as well just do, one thing. There is no need to sort of diversify or strategize your play. And we would consider that a poor design. So a good design is one where there's lots of diversity in the optimal choices of the players. And a recent example of that, it's not just in the car racing genre, there's many other examples, of course. This is CSR racing. It's on the mobile. And you can just see like the level of customization. You can even choose different axles and, different kind of discs, brakes, and, all this massive customization. And the problem is that if you allow so much customization, it actually doesn't matter, to the player. Like, it doesn't matter what I do, my car always behaves the same. Then they're not going to spend so much money. So the way these games actually make money is people buying the customization packs and stuff for their car. And if it doesn't have any impact, then people are not going to be interested in doing it. Okay, so this really is a revenue consideration, this diversity of play. So that's the classical era. And then I just want to quickly transition to the modern era. And I think this is actually, when I look at what people have done on video game research in our field, they have been largely concerned with these modern questions, which makes sense because those are the questions that are emerging. And I think the difference between what I have been calling the classical era and what I'm calling the modern era is roughly along 2 directions. So one is the business model of video games changed. And it changed basically at the advent of the internet and this connectivity that we have. And the other side of it is when I was a child playing games, and maybe when some of you were playing games, it was sort of a more local feel, right? So it's just like I'm playing games with my friends. Now there's this massive interconnectivity. You can play against thousands of other people. And there's this question of how do I match people? How do I make it fun when when basically strangers are interacting with each other? And I would say these are the 2 dominant directions I've seen the video game research and the industry's concern go towards. How do we manage the business and how do we connect people? So the business changed because when I was a child, when people played video games, you typically had a console at home, like an Atari or Nintendo, and you had to buy the games, and the games were relatively expensive, like $60. You could rent the games, which I did quite often, but that was sort of a little bit like that has gone because it's went the way of Blockbuster essentially. So the renting of games in stores at least is not really something that happens anymore. So back then it was mostly about buying games, and games are very expensive, like $60 a game, much more expensive than the movies and the music, like a computer, like a compact disc for music. So it was quite an investment in the game. And the video game companies sort of made all their money upfront. So it's like, I sell you this disc and then you can play that game as long as you want. Okay. And they wanted to maximize like how fun the games are so that, I have a reputation as a publisher that I make fun games, that next time I release a game, they're going to buy it. And I make my money all up front at the beginning. But smart people realize that, well, I actually leaving some money on the table because I get at most $60 per person who buys the game. So the people who are really enjoying the game or really addicted to the game, can we continue to make money from them after the initial sale? One way that has happened is through subscription-based games. So World of Warcraft is a subscription, probably the most famous subscription-based game, where you pay $14.95 a month. I think it's still $14.95 a month. In the world you go in there, it's absolutely huge world, and you could probably spend like all day in there. And I've actually known people who spend 6 to 8 hours a day, maybe at least playing World of Warcraft. And it's become almost like a second virtual life. And actually, there was quite a lot of research done by psychologists and even sociologists in the direction of what do these virtual worlds mean? What is the nature of relationship between people in those virtual worlds? But the subscription model, the other pictures I have there are more like like Netflix model, which I actually haven't seen too much work on in terms of like what works better, like a Netflix model subscription for video games or when people actually buy them. But the dominant way nowadays that the industry has gone is more towards free to play or freemium games. This is the dominant model on the mobile platforms where you download a game for free and you can play the game for free basically as long as you like. But your progress, it will undoubtedly be hindered because the free version of the game, well, there's really only one version, but if you play it for free, then it's slow to progress through the game. And basically you can buy items that make the game progress faster or make it more fun in some way. These are the two video games that I really, when I started to think about mobile, I obsessed myself with. I actually played quite a lot for research purposes. I played Clash of Clans and Candy Crush. They're very well-designed games that really get you can get totally obsessed, especially with Clash of Clans. And I decided I would play this game until I wanted to spend money, just to understand the psychology of people who spend money on these games. And it took me about 6 months. At the 6-month mark, I was like, wow, I really would like to buy something. And that's when I went cold turkey. I just quit. Just like one day, okay, I'm not playing this game anymore. But for people who have played that game, they just know how sinister in a sense it is. They really play with your perception of time and your feeling of how you're making progress and your notions of investment and, sunk cost fallacies, all kinds of stuff. They hire PhDs in psychology to think about how to get people hooked on these games. Okay, so they're very powerful questions there about how to design these effectively. I mentioned already the massively multiplayer side. These are two games, League of Legends I mentioned already, and World of Tanks. There was some stat that I thought was interesting. World of Tanks is basically like a tank conflict game. And there was like more, I think they said like, there was a time there was like more battles in World of Tanks than there was in like World War II. Okay, so this simulation of this tank-based war, which the European conflict of World War II was largely tank-based. It's larger in the virtual world than it was in reality. Okay, so it just shows you, it gives you a sense of how big these games are in terms of social impact. Now, the modern era, especially this freemium side has given rise to quite a lot of research in recent years. This is a very broad overview. I just want to mention a couple. One is loot box design. I think I saw Chalet in the audience, and I really appreciate this research. It got published in Management Science, which I think is a good signal of interest in research purely motivated by video games. When I started working on video games 2013, I was always thinking, you know, if I just start talking about video games, people are not going to think that's an interesting context, right? At the time, you know, everybody was more interested in the questions of like warehousing and maybe assortment optimization or dynamic pricing, things that felt more practical. And video games sort of felt like, well, is that really business? Is that really practical? Is that really serious? Okay, maybe we should be doing healthcare. We can help save lives if we do that. Why would you study video games? It's all for fun anyway. But I think it has a meaning in people's lives, as I've talked about already. And when I saw this loot box design paper and I saw that it was accepted at Management Science and will be published there, I thought, wow, this is a real signal for me. And that's actually what got me thinking about giving this presentation. So that paper looks at the question of how to design loot boxes. And a loot box in a game, in order to get things in the game, many of these, you know, I would like to buy like a new weapon for my character. I would like to acquire maybe a new, you know, suit of armor. You can't buy it directly. So the companies have designed it in such a way that you buy things through some random draw called a loot box. And the game designer has the choice over the randomness in a sense. They can look at the probability distributions of releasing the products with certain levels of rarity or value. And that paper looked at the question of how do I design these probability distributions and the prices and stuff over time. And I really appreciate that paper. And this is what I would call a virtual good design. So how do I price virtual goods? And virtual goods are things, like I said, weapons, armor, other things that are happening in the game. The one on the right, this is the paper with Li Fei and Xu Ying I've been working on recently. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so let me just move on for now. Another question, this is one that I find really interesting, a modern video game design question, is a virtual reward design. This is something that's kind of cool. So inside of a video game, you can reward people's actions by giving them not real money, but like virtual things, right? And the thing that's interesting as a video game designer, it basically costs you nothing to give somebody like a virtual like sword. Okay, basically it's like a flip of a 0-1 variable. I didn't have it and then I do have it. Okay, so all the considerations of whether to do certain things in video game space is not, there's not this question of like production and inventory costs. It's all about like kind of cannibalization. Like if I give them this, then they won't take this action, they will take that action. So it becomes like a very strategic when you think about rewarding people in a virtual space. What you're seeing here in the picture of this like piñata looking thing. So what the game, you're going through the game and you maybe die or get stuck or something. And now they put up this picture here that says, hey, we'll give you a bunch of items if you watch this ad. If you watch this, video from like Toyota or Lexus or, maybe some other video game designer. Okay. So it's rewarding you to take sort of actions that are valuable for the video game company. Okay, and this is what we call virtual reward. And a few people have worked on that. I had a paper on that with Li Fei and Mahesh that is an MSOM. Hongguo Xu Ying had this paper also on this question in Palm. Okay, so the people have been looking at virtual reward design, and I think there's a big future in that as well. Okay, I think there's actually a whole bunch of modern video game design questions, and this is just the some that I have worked on and I've been excited about. Now you might say to yourself, okay, Chris, it's all very interesting for you to be interested in video games and having fun and publishing them in our journals. What about like interest on the industry side? Okay, like there is a real video game industry. Do they have any hope of caring about what we can offer as operations researchers? And I have been to some video game conferences and talked to video game designers. Actually, talking to industry people is not really my strength. And actually, that's one thing I hope as we go along, we have people who are like more brave and more interested in industry to actually connect with more people. But this was one that I did, one video game designer I did get in touch with, and he has a lot of interest in what we can offer. This is Paul Tozer. I've talked to him several times over the years. He was a video game designer. Just to give you an idea of his pedigree, he was the designer of Metroid Prime 3, which is one of the classic games on Nintendo GameCube. So he's been designing for many years. He wrote a series of articles I thought were very interesting. And then luckily at the time, I was actually following this video game website. It's called Gamma Sutra. And I was, regularly reading the articles there, and I noticed decision modeling and optimization in game design. I'm like, wow, that's really kind of what I'm talking about. And it ended up being a 9-part series, and I ended up consulting with him a little bit on that and editing his articles. Basically, he's a video game designer, and he learned like Excel Solver, and he was thinking about ways he could use Excel Solver to help him design games. And he wrote 9 articles on that. I have to say that I kind of, shamelessly just took some of his articles and developed them into more sophisticated mathematical models. And actually, a couple of my recent papers are really just adaptations of his ideas, okay, that he initiated in these articles. And I think it's, you could look at them. All of these things that he talks about are amazing ideas. Balancing, there's this production queues is an interesting one, which is more like, if you played a game like Civilization or something like that, this production is like, okay, how long should it take to build this thing and what should the ingredients be? It's almost like kind of how do I optimally design recipes that the player needs to kind of put together to make certain items and to progress. Okay, so this is another kind of question that he talks on, and this is a 9-part series. And in the first part, he kind of defends, because his audience here is video game designers, and he's telling them, hey, you guys should know this tool. He actually did a survey of other video game designers, and almost no video game designers really knew about optimization at the time. This is 2013. I'd be interested in the updates since then. Because the video game design, for people who might not be familiar, a lot of video game design questions are done by what's considered more the art side. So video game industry has the tech side, all the guys who do the graphics and the coding. But then there's this artistic side, similar to movies, of the people who are the artists who conceive of the story, conceive of the characters. And video game design has traditionally been more aligned with that artistic side. Okay, they're just sort of the view, oh, that's, these guys have a knack for coming up with fun mechanics and cool levels. Okay, so that level of kind of scientific side of video game design, I think, is still evolving. And this is where I think we can contribute. This is just a quote to give you a flavor of what his view of what we can offer. So the current methodology for a lot of design is somebody comes up with a design. So some group of artists that say, hey, this would be a cool concept, and this would be a cool world, cool level, cool enemies, cool, obstacles for the characters, the players to interact with. And then they kind of iterate around that. They just say, oh, what if we move this? What if we tweak? It's a very local searchy thing. Okay, so the local search is kind of like the dominant methodology that people are thinking about right now in the industry level design strategy. And he's saying because of that, it's very iterative. It's like searching in the dark a little bit. It can be very much a productivity bottleneck and a source of defects, and it's actually very risky, because if I start with a bad initial design and I do local search around that, it might not actually be that globally good. So people might not actually like the game. And there's many abortive games that are released on mobile platforms. There's a lot of money and time and effort put into the design, and people don't have fun with it, and then it flops. Okay, so this is a very prevalent problem in the industry. And so this last paragraph was the one I found most intriguing. He's saying if used properly, decision modeling, and what he means by decision modeling is specifically in his use was like Excel solver solving linear and integer programs for the most part, can significantly enhance aspects of the design process. We should be able to search through a much larger number of possible solutions. So he even likes the feasibility questions. So if you think about, I need to design a level with these specifications, even coming up with a feasible design can be hard. And he actually appreciated that some of our tools actually help with feasibility. And you can actually get better results. So the idea, and this is the concept that I have, is that somehow if we use optimization, we can come up with a better starting design that they can still play test around in order to like tweak it and work out some of the kinks and make it look beautiful or whatever additional things they want to add. So I think it can help sort of like add some global optimization potential to what is currently done in practice. And I believe there's hope there. I have talked to video game companies who have been interested in the ideas that I've had. I didn't happen to follow up on those. I find it hard to interact with industry myself. I'm more like a math in the backroom theory guy. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for someone who's inclined to talk to businesses and companies to actually make progress here. And I truly believe this is the one thing I want to say. There's like an endless supply of problems in this area. I mean, so many different kinds of ways that video games make money by selling virtual items. There's so many questions of how to design the games. There's just a million decisions that you need to make in order to put a game together. And I think there's opportunity for decision modeling, optimization, and all the tools of OR to apply there. Just to give you just a hint, there's are 3 books that I've recently found through interactions. Actually, Ifu, one of my co-authors, pointed some of these out to me. Players Making Decisions, this book on the left, I really feel it's like a book. You get that book and you open it on almost any page. It's like, wow, here's something that we could model and try to solve. Okay. And some of the questions are actually being studied by computer scientists. So the game on the right, the book on the right here, Artificial Intelligence in Games. You can see that they're looking at a lot of questions I've described here, but a little bit more empirical, algorithmic, numerical. And I think what, as operations researchers, we could add is something to the structure and with our ability to look at optimality and the value of looking at things in terms of an optimality lens. So I think even on the academic side of this, we can offer a lot in our community. And the book in the middle is, I think, the thing that makes it really interesting is that video game optimization, if you like, or video game design is different than a lot of other things because video games are very psychological. What we need to do is, for instance, the main idea of like, I want to design the game for it to be fun, right? But what is fun, right? Fun is like an interesting psychological concept. And actually there's this book, that's a book from 2020, the book in the middle there is a book all on the psychological theory of what makes the game fun and the psychology of the players. So I think there's this component of like behavioral operations research, which becomes central to the questions of video game design with this concept of fun. And actually, when you think about video games, I want to highlight, before I go into a few of the specific projects I've been working on, I just wanted to highlight some things I think which make video games interesting as a problem to model and solve. One is that video games should be challenging. So it's a little bit different than, like, say, I'm trying to design the optimal service experience or the optimal website design, where I want everything to be very smooth and it takes very little effort and it's easy to know where to click and how to do whatever. In video games, people come there in order to test their skill in some way. So there should be some component of challenge to it. Actually, the image there is of this movie called A Fistful of Quarters, or The King of Kong, A Fistful of Quarters, which actually details the early kind of machismo culture of the arcade scene. So the original arcade games where people put quarters into video games. And there was a lot of competitiveness, and it was emphasis on the skill of the game. And that's why, there is kind of this esports competitive aspect of video games, which I think a challenge, and the balanced challenge becomes actually an important question there. Another one, and this is actually one of the theories of fun, which is popular in video game circles, is the concept of flow, which is basically how skill and challenge meet each other. So what makes video games so addictive and all-encompassing is that it's one of those activities where it's not passive. So it's not like you can only watch Netflix for so many hours before you feel like garbage, like you're just sitting there eating, potato chips and whatever, not really applying yourself. But you don't get the same feeling when you're playing games, because you get a sense of accomplishment and you feel like your skills are being used and developed, at least to some extent. Okay, and I think that's one reason what makes games so compelling. And so I think there's this concept of flow, which is the meeting of skill and challenge. Sort of like when you feel like you're arising to do something, you have this sense of accomplishment and this sense of focus. Okay, and this is really an important consideration when we think about the design of games. Another important concept of games, as opposed to other kinds of entertainment like music and movies and stuff, is that video game players have a choice. They make choices in the game. And so there is this decision making that one needs to model when they think about designing games, which is different than designing more passive experiences inside of other kinds of systems. Okay, so we have to allow the players to make choices for it to be fun. Another one is fairness. So this is the concept, well, if you have players playing against each other, you shouldn't have one player to be totally stronger than another one. That reduces the fun, because then it becomes more like the real world. Like one reason people like video games is that it's like a fiction where you're powerful. In real world, we know we're not that powerful because there's these rich guys and powerful people that control the world or whatever. But in the video game world, we can be like a god, we can be a monster, we can be very powerful. And so when we feel that the real world, the unfairness of the real world comes into our virtual world, then it sort of breaks down. It doesn't feel fair anymore, and it doesn't become as fun. The fifth one is engagement. This is a terminology of the industry. It basically means addiction. Okay, how do I get people addicted to these games, which is an important consideration when you really want to make money. Okay, so how do I make things sticky? What makes people want to continue to do the same thing over and over again, or come back and return to do something? How do I keep it in their mind even when they're not playing? These are the questions of engagement that makes it sort of a very all-encompassing experience playing games. And lastly, this is the one I find also interesting, is that there is this connection between the real world and the meta world. How do I manage that? Do I want it to make very fictional, or do I want it to feel like the real world? How much should real world money affect this? Okay, versus, I don't want real world money to enter my game. Okay, so this is the meta game considerations when we think about game design. And I think these are all things that make video game research distinct than from some of the other things that we can look at with our tools, some of the concepts here. Now, let me just give an illustration of that with a few examples, and I'm going to go over it relatively quickly, so you probably won't get like the full idea of what we did. If you're interested in these projects, I have manuscripts on most of them. I think you can get them on SSRN or Archive. If people are sufficiently interested, they can email me, and I'm happy to give the latest version of all of these projects. But I want to go over them at a very high level just to give you a flavor of it. The first is that we did take an attempt. This is Yifu, me, and Li Fei. We made an attempt at this level design question. And this is how we kind of approached it. I think level design could be a whole subfield because there's so many questions, but we took a crack at something relatively simple. We looked at a game, sort of a flat level, and we just thought about how to arrange the encounters, or even in an easier context, how to arrange the enemies that you're trying to defeat. So these are the classic enemies from Mario. This is Mario 1. Okay, so maybe you've seen these before. We have a Goomba, a Koopa, and Bowser. Those are the names. And associated with each of the characters is what we call a reward. So it's like some reward you get for defeating that enemy, maybe some sense of accomplishment, maybe some coins or whatever. Okay, so there's some reward associated with these enemies and some difficulty. Okay, so some of them are more difficult than others to defeat. And the question is, how do I arrange these enemies in this level? Okay, and this is actually the level 1-1 of Mario, one of the classic images in video games. Okay, so you can do it in different ways. So the question we looked at is like, how do I arrange, how do I sequence the enemies? Okay, that's the question we focused on. So should I put the Goomba first, who has a certain level of difficulty, and then the Koopa, who is a little bit more difficult to defeat, and then maybe Bowser at the end? So I have this sort of like rising difficulty as I go throughout the level. Or should it be arranged a little different? Maybe you should start with the Koopa, who's a little harder, go to the Goomba, like ease off a little bit, and then go to Bowser, right? So we're trying to think about how to arrange the difficulty of the, and then we look at a model that we could use to evaluate what is a good sequence. And I think this goes to the heart of the challenge of this video game research. And I actually think what makes it interesting is that typically the objectives are going to be complicated. I think that's where I've been working on video game research, for I think 8 years or so now, and coming up with a convincing and interesting utility function that you want, that is tractable to optimize and has enough of the psychological trade-offs that a player would think about. This is what I think what makes it really interesting, and I think people have made some progress on that. So what we did to model the utility here is we thought about like this. People like to get rewards, but they become accustomed to rewards. If you keep giving me $1 every time I defeat somebody, eventually that dollar feels less valuable to me, okay? Because I'm accustomed to that level of reward. So there's a reward process, and I'm adapting to that sense of reward. Same with the difficulty. So I'm facing some difficulties of the enemy, and I'm adapting to that difficulty as I learn, and I get used to that kind of difficulty as the game progresses. So the rewards give rise to a utility process. So I like those rewards, and difficulty gives rise to a disutility process, because difficulty requires effort on my part, which can wear me out. Okay, so there's some disutility associated with facing difficulty. And as I said, we modeled it in this way. And actually, this was inspired by some work on the service operations side. So that's Gupta and I think Kamakar and Rolls had a paper on service design that looked at this kind of acclamation process. I think it was Aflaki and Popescu who also looked at this kind of acclamation of utility to a kind of a stream or a process of rewards over time or utilities over time. So we kind of adapted their ideas, but what we did is we added difficulty. The previous models didn't look at the question of difficulty. And as I said, difficulty or challenge is one of the things I think that is sort of interesting and distinct from a video game design perspective. So we looked at how they adapted. So this adaptation process is like a continuous time thing. And then we looked at the different arrangements of the enemies, which one will give you the optimal utility, okay? And our utility function was designed. It's sort of elaborate. I won't go into all the details there. But what we get out of that, I think, is something that is interesting. So when we look at this kind of utility function, we ask ourselves, what is the optimal design with respect to the different specifications of that utility function? And based on different parameters, we get different kinds of outcomes. I won't go into the details of like when you get what. I just want to focus here that under different parameters, specifications about how sensitive people are to difficulty or how sensitive they are to rewards or how quickly they adapt, or etc., or how the range of the difficulties of the game elements are compared to their rewards. We get different designs. And the one that excited me the most was this one in the top. Oops. Is the one in the top right here, this Mega Man one, where this is cool, where we actually found the optimal design is something like a wave of difficulty. It starts easy, then it gets difficult, and it gets easy again, and it gets difficult again. And this is actually something when I talk to video game designers and I ask them, and actually the original article series by Paul Tozer that I mentioned before, it's sort of a general principle that they have, is that they believe that when it comes to games, it should have this wave-like feature. Okay, it should be getting easy then hard, easy and hard. The idea, if it gets too hard, then people just get burned out, right? They don't, they get frustrated, and you need them to recover a little bit in order for them to feel like I'm going to play this for a very long session. I don't get tired or burned out. It turns out that even with the utility function that has both difficulty and reward processes involved, we don't always get this wave feature, but we do under some specifications. And we call this the mini boss design. So you have a boss at the end who is difficult, but you also have a boss in the middle of the level, like a mini boss in the terminology of video games. When you start out easy, you face a mini boss, and then it gets easier again, then you gear up for the boss. Okay, these are the kind of results that we can get with our model. We show that they're optimal to have this design. And how would a video game designer use this result? They would say, look, I have these kind of game elements. I'm thinking about this kind of difficulty reward ratio. How should I think about what the level should be like? Should I have it start easy, start hard, have a mini boss, not have a mini boss? Okay, and we can give sort of this general idea of what they might do when they start thinking about how to design their level. Okay. Next, I worked on this project with also Yifu and Li Fei and also this undergrad student Benny. And we looked at the question of world design. So now you have a collection of levels. How do I arrange them? And I talked about this a little earlier. This is one of my favorite games when I was a kid. It's called Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. And I remember having the distinct question. This is the way they arrange the levels. And this seemed very, very strange to me that they would arrange the levels like that. And I wondered, like, why don't they just arrange it like this? It wouldn't. Think about the design effort to go from the picture on the left to the picture on the right. All you need to do, and I did it on the screen, is just to change the color of some of the pixels, right? Make it orange across the top and then green down here, and you would just change the overall design of the game. Okay. And so, like, this is a basic question. Like, it's a graph design question that we looked at. How do I arrange these levels to have certain precedences and certain lengths of paths? And which design is going to be optimal? So again, the real problem and the challenge here is to come up with an interesting and tractable utility function that has some meaning. I won't go into all the details of the specific form of the utility function here. I will just talk about the trade-offs we considered. One of the trade-offs is that people like to play. And so the longer they can play, the better. Okay, so in a sense of an optimal design of a game, it should have many levels in sequence. You just go through all of them and you finish the game. Okay. So that would be fun. It's a game with a lot of levels that you can play for a long time. This would be a good design of a world. Okay, one that has a lot of levels that you can play for a long time. However, not everybody has a lot of time to play, right? So they would like to feel like they're making progress without having to go through so many hoops, right? And so from that perspective, it's like a disutility for overplay. I would like to finish this world. I would like to finish the game, but I don't want it to take forever to finish. And from the perspective of giving the players many different options to feel like they finished the game, you would want to design a graph that looks something like the second one here. You can give them you could finish it in 1 level, 2 levels, 3 levels, 4 levels, like, and it gives you lots of option for the duration of play or the amount of effort you need to put in to actually feel like you finished the game or progress through the game. But this actually also gives rise to a lot of complications. So you can imagine if you looked at the map, how would you even represent it on the previous screen? There'd be so many different possible paths and arrangements of the levels, and it looks very complicated, right? And so we also considered this kind of paradox of choice kind of consideration that, research has shown that when players are presented with too many choices about what they can do, it actually gives them some kind of paralysis. And that paralysis is kind of a form of disutility, especially if you only have a limited amount of time to play. Okay. And so what we show under certain consideration, on certain assumptions about what the utility functions are, we're able to show the optimality of what we call the side quest tree, which is the one on the bottom here. There's a direct path. You can finish the game right away, or you can go on this sort of side quest, you know, big journey through side quest, okay, for whatever duration you want. And for people who are familiar with a game like Grand Theft Auto, this is sort of like, if you really play Grand Theft Auto just for the storyline or the story arc, you can finish the game very fast. But if you get into all these side quests and all these side adventures, you can play the game for months, even years, right? So this is an example of the kind of thing that we looked at when it comes to world design. Let me skip the next slide. I'm noticing I'm a little bit limited here on time, but I just want to give you another flavor. So we looked at that diversity question as well. This is with Osama and Will. Recently submitted this paper, hoping for the best. This is an interesting question. So actually that Paul Tozer article, so remember the industry guy who wrote those 9 articles, this was actually one of the problems that he posed, and we kind of took it in, looked at it in a mathematical sense, where I'm trying to think about, the real question is the player's objectives. They want to put together like a tank here that will be like the max, will be able to deliver the maximum amount of damage. But he has various constraints that they need to satisfy. So they can't, you know, they have limited resources, so they can't choose any weapon that they want. And what the designer would like to do is they don't want it so that the players always choose the same weapons. We would like it if they choose a variety of different weapons over time as they progress through the level, through the game, and get more resources. Because if you go back here, if nobody ever chooses a laser ever, then I wasted my effort to actually designing the laser. Okay, so I wouldn't like that. I would like it at some point in time, the laser is a good weapon for the player to use. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. We're looking for, as the resources evolve, the strategy changes. Okay. Now, when we thought about that, we related it to, it's actually give rise to an interesting optimization theory question. And actually the paper we did was motivated by games, but there was a lot of development of optimization theory in the paper as well. And the basic idea of this optimization is that I want what we call diverse in, diverse out. So let's look at this linear program here. It's AX equals B, X non-negative. And what I'm looking for is as I change right-hand side, as the right-hand side evolves, I would like there to be many different optimal solutions. Now, how do I mean different here in the context of a linear program? I mean different in terms of the support of the solution. So I define this word loadout. So loadout refers to like the collection of things that you invest in. And a loadout is basically the support of an optimal solution. And I would like there to be a lot of different supports of optimal solutions. And if I choose different supports, it means I'm choosing different columns at different points in time to invest in. And this is what we mean by the diversity of play and the differences in strategy. And so what makes this problem interesting is that it's actually the following kind of optimization problem. You're trying to choose the matrix A and the cost vector C, or the reward vector in this case, because it's a maximization problem, to maximize the number of different supports of optimal solutions. Okay. And it turns out, and now I'm very low on time, this relates to something called the theory of triangulations of cones and polytopes. And using that theory of triangulations, we can actually come up with designs that give rise to many different optimal strategies as the right-hand side changes. And it looks something like this. It's actually kind of intuitive. Each of the columns should have something that's very strong in, but also something that's very weak in. Okay, so it's a generalization of that general intuition. If I want the weapons all to be played at some point in time, they should have something it's really good at and something it's bad at. Okay, so that at some point in time, it's really good to use that one and not the other ones. Okay, so that's the general idea, which we kind of formalize in the mathematics. I ran out of time, so this is the last one I want to talk about. I know maybe people are going to jump off, but maybe this is a recent paper with Fei and Shuying, where we look at pricing a virtual good, which is extra moves in a puzzle game. So I'm sure many of you have played a Candy Crush where you have a limited number of moves before to pass a level. And when you run out of moves, they start to want to ask you if you would like to pay money for extra moves to finish the puzzle. And what's interesting is that we found there's this game in China where it's called I think it's called Xiao Xiao Le or something. I forget the name now, where they sell you these extra moves either at the end when you don't pass the puzzle or in advance at the beginning. And we thought that was very cool. So the question we had was, how do I differentially price? How much cheaper should the ones that you purchase in advance be compared to the ones in the spot market when you don't pass the level? And also, whether I should offer them in advance or not, because Candy Crush does not offer bonus actions in advance. They only offer them at the end. But this game chooses a different strategy. Okay, so we looked at this question and we developed a model to do that and came up with some results. And that's maybe the last thing I want to say. Then I can maybe go to questions. I just think the scope of video game research is so wide open. There's so many tools that we have in operations research, optimization, and combinatorics, game theory, stochastics, behavioral, econometrics, big data. There's these really cool elements that make games interesting: challenge, flow, choice, all these things. One can it's just like a smorgasbord here. You just say, hey, I'd like to look at virtual design and how it contributes to the flow of the game. Using some behavioral models, and maybe I have some data. I want to do some machine learning or something on it, right? I just think, you could just look at this recipe and just go forever. And what I find especially rewarding is that I would really excited by the possibility that young researchers who grew up playing games, they think about the question that fascinated them when they were playing games as a child or even up until the present day. And leveraging all the techniques and tools and insights we have from operations research to look at these questions. And I just think it's fun. And that's maybe my main message, is that I really encourage you all to have fun. Please let me know if you're interested. Send me an email, say, Chris, I'm excited. I have so many people reached out to me recently. It's like I can't follow up with all of them, but I maybe will put you in touch with other people. Hey, this guy likes video games. Why don't you work with him? Why don't you talk to him about this? So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk. I'm really excited about this opportunity for our field and community, and eager to be there to support anyone who wants to pursue it. So maybe I'll end it there. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Chris. We did have a couple of questions. So what I'm going to do is send them to you in an email. Maybe you can answer them, and then I'll send that out to all the attendees.
Sounds good. Yeah, sorry to go over time.
That's okay. Thank you so much for doing this.
No problem. Yeah.
And thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.